good afternoon. Hopefully we'll get a couple more folks back here from lunch in a minute. Pleasure to be here. As Dieter mentioned, I'm a partner with ISG and lead our West region, so really across our services and portfolio. Prior to that, I was a part of the network advisory group and actually started our network transformation practice, 4 or 5 years ago now. So really focused on the upfront planning, architecture, design, and business case around technology transformation. So this is very close to my heart as far as technology and the progression of services in the network space. So today we're going to pivot to security. It's been mentioned a few times through the various speakers and panels as really a core component of any network transformation strategy. Looking more broadly at security, it's obviously a huge theme in the enterprise space. $75 billion industry in 2017, actually projected to be $90 billion in 2018. With that said, 2/3 of enterprises are still breached. So it's still a huge pain point for enterprises looking forward on really how to remain agile and secure at the same time. And it's a pretty penny if you do get breached. The average cost per breach is $3.6 million. So that can add up quickly if you're not secure. From an industry perspective, the big spend categories as far as enterprise or verticals is financial services, government, as well as manufacturing, discrete manufacturing, that is. So U.S. obviously being a big area for those types of companies. So huge point for us here in the U.S. Today we're going to talk really about the concept of zero trust, the factors that are increasing the focus on network security, and how does zero trust work. So 2018 has really looked like the last couple years as far as notable breaches. So you see some pretty big names up here: Orbitz, Panera, the Sacramento Bee newspaper hit. It's not that big of a paper per se, but from a market perspective, there were some pretty big impacts because they released voter record data. 19 million California voter information was stolen from the network. So it impacts government, it impacts private sector really to the same degree. And so the focus really has maintained through 2018. And one that's not on here that is in the industry we're all familiar with is T-Mobile, which just happened in August. So the breaches are really coming from a variety of areas. Obviously, hackers are becoming more mature and they're morphing and getting more sophisticated in their attacks, but 2/3 are still a result of passwords. So I have a little video to play for you, which is more comedy than technical application. Do I play it or do you play it?
You know, we've been hearing a lot about cybersecurity lately, largely because of what happened to Sony. Companies and individuals are more concerned about the safety and privacy of their information than ever. President Obama has unveiled a number of new proposals this week to crack down on hackers, and he plans to address this in the State of the Union speech on Tuesday. And it's great that the government is working on this, but the truth of the matter is we need to do a better job of protecting ourselves. You know, the most popular password in the United States is password 123. And as long as that's the case, we're vulnerable. So today we sent a camera out on a Hollywood Boulevard to help people by asking them to tell us their password. And this is how that went.
We're talking about cybersecurity today and how safe people's passwords are. What is one of your online passwords currently?
It is my dog's name and the year I graduated from high school.
Oh, what kind of dog do you have?
I have a Chihuahua Papillon.
And what's its name?
Jameson.
Jameson. And where'd you go to school?
I went to school back in Greensburg, Pennsylvania.
What school?
Hempfield Area Senior High School.
Oh, when did you graduate?
In 2009.
Oh, great.
It's like my cat's name and then just like a random number.
Okay.
But,
Have you had this cat for a while?
yeah, she's my childhood pet.
Aw. And what's her name?
Her name is Jolie.
Jolie.
Mm-hmm.
So like a password of yours would be Jolie and then a number.
Yeah.
Like number 1?
Like my birthday,
Oh, when is your birthday?
June 12th.
Oh, nice. And what year were you born?
95.
Oh, great.
Mm-hmm.
So Jolie, 6, 12, 95.
Yes.
Got it.
So you mean to give my password right now? No, I cannot do that.
but we all want to know what it is so we can tell you if it's strong or not.
Oh my goodness. Let me think. Okay, one is Tel Aviv. Yeah. 468, and then Israel. It's only 3, but it's for me it's strong enough.
Ireland, 1, 2, 3, 4. Gemma, 1, 2, 3. Spelled Gemma.
Well, most of them are Italian.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
Like what's a good Italian password?
My grandma's name,
What's your grandma's name?
Maria.
Maria. So Maria is your password?
Oh yeah, now you know my password. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, the important thing is they learned a terrible lesson.
So you get the point. Now this is oversimplified because these folks are out on the street and probably not thinking through this, but the same holds true in enterprises, right? People oversimplify their password structures and it becomes an easy way for hackers to get in. So enterprises have addressed this issue over the last couple of years. This video is 2 years old, but the industry is really catching up to make sure that there's multi-factor authentication and encryption and all those good things that are going to make sure that these kind of folks don't impact your network. But it really shows how the industry has changed and morphed, but the core root and cause of a lot of these breaches is really around either misuse of credentials or passwords. All right, so going back a little bit to today's world, really perimeter security is based on a broken trust model. And what do we mean by that? It assumes that once a trusted user has accessed the network, that there's no additional verification that's required at its very basic level. Once you have access, you're assumed to be trusted, which results in poor access control. So once a hacker gets in, they have the ability to morph and change within the environment, which is where a lot of the systems impacts actually happen. So adding to this concern is really the change of the network as we know it. So perimeter was designed around the concept of brick and mortar. Things are in a closed environment where you control what comes in and out. With the proliferation of all the things we've talked about today, including mobile devices, the move to IoT, the number of cloud applications, that wall, that border doesn't really exist anymore. So while the perimeter is still important, it has to be augmented by other aspects of securities and controls to make sure that those types of breaches don't happen and implicate the network. So what is zero trust? Zero trust is a concept. It's not a technology or a tool. It's a series or a stack of tools and technologies that are really founded on the premise of don't trust anyone or anything that's coming in or out of the network. It goes back quite a ways, so there's a big buzz around zero trust right now, but it goes back actually to 2003. So at the Jericho conference, a couple financial services came together, financial services companies came together and presented an architecture that was based on a no trust architecture. And then there was an advisor or consultant from Forrester in 2008 that coined the term zero trust, which was really based on a next-gen firewall, so changing the stack of the network and centralizing security controls, but still very much around your core network-centric model. So since 2008, a lot of things that have happened as far as applications and that move to the cloud that have really changed the concept to not just a network-centric approach, but also an app or a software-centric approach to security, both having an impact or a contribution to your core network infrastructure. And today, because there hasn't been a huge boom or explosion in new technologies around security and innovation, not taking away from any security folks in the room, I hope, really this concept of we have to take governance and policy and bring that together with technology to create a solution that can be embedded in your network transformation strategy, which is really what has come together with zero trust. So there's a ton of information flooding the market. There's a lot of different approaches. There's a lot of different tools, technologies, and companies that are providing solutions, including some of your named suspects like Palo Alto Networks and Centrify They all have different approaches and ways to look at zero trust, but the fundamental solution is the same. It's around securing inside and outside the walls of the network to ensure that you have ubiquitous security throughout. So why is it important now? Stating some of the obvious, the threats have become more mature. Traditional models are really designed to protect the perimeter and somewhat ignore invisible threats. So a lot of the hacker and attacks are approached from more of a reactive response as opposed to a proactive monitoring or structure that allows you to continuously manage and monitor those security threats. All right, so what is zero trust? You can read my little cartoon while you're listening here. I thought it was kind of funny, actually. So anyway, so it's a concept centered around, and it really is a concept. It has to be something that your organization believes in, because it's based on the premise that you don't trust anyone, which is going to create a cultural and an operational change to your environment through policy and administration, as well as the tools and the design and the architecture that you build it around. The strategy is to trust no one and not let anyone into the network until they're authenticated and then encrypted and mapped to certain systems or tools that they're supposed to have access to. So when you're connecting from a particular network, and one important thing to point out is because there are so many devices now accessing the network, in fact, it is estimated that 2 to 3 times what IT estimates are the number of actual devices that are accessing information on the network. So if you think about all of the managed tools that are in the network or devices that are in the network, there's typically 2 to 3 times that are actually gaining or trying to get access to your software and your data center and your systems. So the network really determines which services that you can access, and then access is granted based on what the tools know about you and your ability to access certain applications or services from the device that has also been verified. So it's a very circular verification system that is based on technologies and tools like identity access management and reverse proxy and encryption. So it's really a way to enforce the idea that nothing can access the network until they've proven that they can be trusted. And there's, I mentioned a couple of the tools, but other tools that are used that can work together in harmony to really create a full stack of zero trust are multi-factor authentication, which a lot of enterprises are doing today, segmentation, IDM, orchestration, as well as systems permissions and scoring. There are some risks that we'll talk about in a minute as far as practical application for enterprises. And the biggest of which is that there has to be governance and policies that actually manage all these things. And it has to be at the task level to ensure that users don't get blocked out or access removed, which can, of course, affect productivity down the line. So some of the key benefits, really moving to that ubiquitous and continuous security model as opposed to thinking with walls and borders. Centralizing security at gateways. We talked a little bit about that earlier, of managing security at the gateway, which can, in theory, give you a more scalable and agile network, and the ability to truly know who's accessing the network through proactive traffic logging. And some of the reports out from the industry is that this can reduce breaches by as much as 50%. So if you're thinking about the price tag at the end of those breaches, that can be a lot of savings. All right, so from an enterprise reality perspective, one of the things that we're looking at from an advisor perspective or through our lens is that there's a ton of confusion about the right approach to do this. So there's not a lot of Googles out there. I didn't mention this in the life cycle of zero trust, but Google released some white papers just 2 years ago about their network, which is built on zero trust governance and architecture, and it's called Beyond Corp. So there's not a lot of Beyond Corps out there. There's not a lot of Googles out there that can really build from the ground up. which has been some of the feedback from our enterprise clients, is that layering on legacy infrastructure can be difficult, but there's ways to approach this through greenfield or app-centric approach to network design that allows you to grow and morph and mature as your network transforms. So as you move off legacy, shift to zero trust concepts that help support that throughout the network as opposed to just thinking about the edge, and then build as you go. Really, some of the other challenges have to do with just belief in the concept. So one of the things that we also see is that security is typically managed separately from network within infrastructure. And oftentimes we're in strategy discussions with enterprises, and we go through network design and architecture, and they say, you know what? We got to bring our security guys in at some point. Wait and do all the network design, and the security guy comes in and checks the box and says, yeah, this doesn't meet the criteria. And what we really think needs to happen is that everybody needs to come to the table, including infrastructure, because if it's an app-centric approach, you have to be thinking about where are we going to go top down or bottom up on our integration of our approach to security. So you've got your apps, you've got your network security, as well as maybe your cybersecurity folks, and then you've got your network engineering team. So there's a lot of people that have to be at the table early and often to buy in on this approach. And zero trust, the fabric of it as far as the technologies and the tools, everyone at one point or another will be adopting a lot of these tools or have already. But the question is how many enterprises will really go all in on the full stack? And the business case is definitely there, just due to the fact that it can save a lot of money as well as ensure that you're secure really throughout the network, as opposed to looking at it through the lens of traditional network architecture and design and looking at the edge or managing to the edge. So no rip and replace is necessary because it is a concept, right? Build around your requirements for your network transformation roadmap or even greenfield when you're moving applications to the cloud, for example. Great business case. And really make it a part of your digital fabric. So it's not an afterthought or it's not a parallel path to address security. It really should be folded into your digital fabric and roadmap. All right. So we have a good panel of folks here that I'm looking forward to speaking with in just a few minutes as we shift gears. The panel is going to be focused on really the practical application and enterprise adoption of zero trust. Are there any challenges to the zero trust concept, alternatives out there? And then what are some factors that can help enterprises mitigate risk around implementation or management of zero trust? So with that, any questions before I bring the panel up? No?
Well, what do you think the challenges will be for the end user community when everything's zero trust and it's a constant validation? It's hard enough to keep up with passwords.
Yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think that's the big thing that we've seen with the adoption is that it has less to do with the technology and it has more to do with ensuring that there's a good communication plan on changes in policy and compliance, because the biggest impact is to the end users. It's not even necessarily the client who has to authenticate or access the software tool, right? It's within the enterprise environment where folks are trying to get in and do application development or access SAP or what have you, and multi-factor authentication is probably one of the bigger pain points. But it's about communicating, making sure users have a clear understanding of how they authenticate, who they need to contact if they have any issues. It also requires a lot of administration on the back end for things like if you don't have a refresh on what folks are supposed to have access to and updating and refreshing IP addresses, for example, then there's going to be downstream impacts on the workforce, which is just something that is going to happen with that governance and policy administration, because it's a big change. Anybody who has to do a multi-factor authentication knows it's a pain. Right. Yeah. All right. Well, with that, I will bring the panel up here, and I will introduce everybody as they come up. Hopefully everybody's here. So we have Indranil, Spencer, so Indranil Sengupta is with NTT. Spencer, you all had the opportunity to meet before, so hopefully he'll have some perspective for us as a fearless leader in our transformation team, as well as some of his prior enterprise experience. And then Aditya?
Yeah.
All right, Aditya Balapur is with Grubhub. So thank you all for being here today. All right, so like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about practical application of Zero Trust, and for that matter, broader security and implications on the network. I wanted to start really with the changing mindset. So, given what you're seeing in the market, and I would ask this maybe first of NTT here, how do you see enterprises adapting to either new security concepts or even an app-centric approach to security as opposed to network-centric?
Yeah, it's hard, right? I think I'm the service provider at this panel, so I can give you a perspective from that angle. So we still see three types of companies when we start talking to them. You have the most problematic is still the enterprise that thinks that nothing can go wrong with them. It's happening out there, but we are secure. Nothing's going to ever happen with us. And we still, believe it or not, 1/3 of the enterprises we talk to are in that category. So that's the biggest challenge that we still have. I would say the second category is the company that has spent a lot of money in security, but looks at security only as a technology thing. And they don't really, so they've thrown a lot of money in buying all the technology that's out there, name it, starting with firewalls, IDS, all the technologies, but without a strategy, without a framework. So now when you talk to them and you try to bring them into a thinking of Zero Trust, and you try to explain to them that no, it's not just about the technology, it's really about the people, process, and the technology, because Zero Trust is not a technology like you mentioned. I think that's a little bit lost on a lot of those enterprises even now. And then the third type is obviously the best type, where they acknowledge either they've had a breach, so they have had a dose of reality, or they acknowledge that, yes, we are in a constant threat kind of situation. What we did yesterday is probably not going to work for us tomorrow. And they're open to looking at this, and they're open to considering a thing like Zero Trust, which is potentially going to be more of a multi-year implementation. It's not just a fix it, here you go, you configure some devices and you're done. I think they are the best, but that's only 1/3 of the enterprise we talk to. So there is still a mindset kind of a thing. There is that hurdle to cross over, I think.
Aditya, what do you think?
So I feel like with every business model now moving towards an app-based approach, the trends are just shifting from securing the network to kind of securing the application. We're moving more and more technologies having enabled SSO, single sign-on, enabling MFA, multi-factor authentication, leveraging more and more device-based authentication, and making sure they're actually identifying, the person, the device who's actually accessing that particular application, the timings. So the whole model is changing, and it's not going to be like, it's not going to happen in like a month or like a few years. It's going to take some time, right? It's a layered approach, and with training, again, as Indranil said, people, process, technology, everything has to be impacted. And as the people, process, and technology kind of learn more about the Zero Trust approach and kind of understand what the impact and the risk factors are to the business, I think it's going to change. But information security for every business has to, start or make the push and introduce better training around people, the management, make them aware of what the risks are to the business, moving the data from inside your network to like outside your network. It's all a SaaS-based model. How do you really secure the data there? Like, how can you enforce data in transit security? How can you enforce data at rest security? So I think those main concepts have to really be more public and be more known to all and everyone really, including the developers, including the product people. And as they become more and more common, I think the thought process is going to change. These things are going to be tied into the design process. These things are going to be tied into the thought process of when they're thinking about a product or when they're thinking about building a service. Mm-hmm. I think those are how you can really change that model.
So what do you think about that concept of having really security as at the table, and how what are your all's experience with having either the CISO or somebody that's representative of security beyond just core network security at the table early in those design discussions?
So I honestly believe for every organization they have to develop a security from insecurity approach. Mm-hmm. Nothing is 100% secure, which we've learned all throughout the past. With all the best security appliances, with all the best security people, it's still, the smallest leak can really lead to a compromise. So I think it's changing the mindset. It cannot be pushed from, one person or the management or CISO or, security management. It has to, like technology, product, all have to really embrace that security is important. Based on the data breaches we've had, phishing is still the largest, the most common way of how organizations are being compromised. How can we change that? How can we better train people to understand that they need to stop clicking links? We can put in all the coolest, the latest, greatest products, right? But it all comes down to common sense, right? Mm-hmm. It all comes down to better helping them understand what the threats and their attack vectors are. So it's not going to be focused on just the security team. That's what I say. It has to be a holistic view of things. It has to be an overall, organization that needs to really, understand that security is an important thing. And, with zero trust and the approach that no one can be trusted, we need to start thinking on every aspect where we can improve security.
Spencer, any comments on enterprise adoption?
Yes, so what these guys said is spot on. I think what I can add is, really layering on to your comments, organizationally, a lot of enterprises lack governance that gives people the guidance on what to do. So I think network engineers understand how to secure the network, and application developers typically know how to secure the application, but they're not working to a higher set of morality, if you will. They're not ethically inclined to follow a set of rules because those rules don't exist. So I think until companies spend more time with overall security governance and lay out here's how it will be, and here's the things you must aspire to in each of your towers, we won't get there.
Yep. I think it's going to be important, like some of the main points is how do you scale security is going to be the leading challenges that enterprises are going to face for the next coming years. Even though how much or how many security people you have, it's going to be still less based on the other departments for companies that have. So I think it's going to be more governance. It's going to be more monitoring how you can have all of those just to make sure you can actually detect when an adversary is actually trying to target your network, mm-hmm. and layering with your training and making sure people are aware of what the adversaries are, how are they trying to attack your networks. I think that's going to be a comprehensive approach that's going to really help us.
Okay.
So let me ask go ahead.
I was going to just jump on to, I think you talked about the user. If you look at a typical enterprise, right, the user access is basically given based on whether your manager gives you the access or approves it or not, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if you think about it, is that really the right way to give user access? Meaning, you're asking the question, who needs access to this application? You actually should be asking, why does this person need access to this application, right? So there has to be a more rigor even in that process where you're authenticating and authorizing users to certain application. And you're saying, like you said, right, mistakes are made.
Yep.
People are going to, so now, if I have access to a medium level application, medium risk application, but somewhere along the way I still have access into a high risk one, if I'm compromised, whoever has attacked me has access to that other application. Right. And that should not happen. There should be an audit at least every 6 months that does this person really need access to that application or not, or what is the role of this person, this specific user, and what are the requirements for that person to accomplish their job? And does that mean all of these access, or, sorry, I cut you off.
That's correct. What I was going to say, in layering on the conversation, you have to accept the fact that there are bad actors in your network already. They are there. There are tools that can detect activity that is not the sort of activity you want to have happening. The question is, can you limit their access to critical data? You may not be able to get rid of all the bad actors there, especially in a large network, right? There's so many ways in, and they can travel around, and they may, knock on this door and knock on that door, but you have to keep them out. But you have to accept that fact. I've actually talked to security folks who will not accept the fact that there are people running around their network. They say, oh, no, we would know if somebody's here. No, you wouldn't.
Right.
That's the whole point.
If they're
any good, no, you won't.
Yes,
right, exactly.
Yes,
Well, and I want to come back to what you just said in a minute on the management aspect. But anything else as far as inhibitors? We talked about governance probably as the biggest, or policy as a big inhibitor to full execution. Any other inhibitors you think to broader adoption of zero trust concept, or even some of the underlying tools that we have out there?
Yeah, I think you touched upon one point in your presentation, which is we still do not see enough number of times that the head of security is at the table when a strategy is being devised. It's still, most of the time we see that, okay, here's the enterprise strategy, here's our plans of digital business, digital transformation. Let's call in the security guys to now secure this whole thing. Well, that's a little bit cart before the horse, because you really need them into and I think the best opportunity for enterprises to really embrace the zero trust model is if they actually commingle it with the digital transformation efforts, because both of those things are going to take time. And both of those things have to be done together, because your digital transformation is where you are basically going out and saying, well, I'm going to reach out to not just my employees, my customers, my partners. We had a presentation on IoT. You're putting all kinds of devices all over the place and gathering data from there. Well, remember, they are out there, and they are out there for the bad people to also target, right? So I think that is still a kind of a misguided approach I think enterprises have, where it's still security is, everybody agrees it needs to be done, but it's actually needs to be infused within the strategy discussion.
Okay, good. So just shifting gears a little bit to actual execution of zero trust. One of the things that I did mention, and you also mentioned in application, going through audits and making sure that folks are why they have access and if that's still valid. One of the big challenges that we see is that administration aspect, and not having the maturity of tools to manage proxies and IP addresses and all those things that need to happen to actually ensure that you don't limit access or eliminate access for users that do have a valid case or reason for needing to get in and use a system or tool to do their job. So let's maybe talk a little bit, Spencer. I know you probably have some thoughts on various tools that can be leveraged within the environment to help mitigate some of those risks.
Well, we're all familiar with multi-factor, right? Or struggling with multi-factor authentication and single sign-on. But that's one piece. It's also how do you zone or segment your network? And I always ask people this question, tell me about your network segmentation architecture. And they look at me like, what? Well, we have a DMZ. right? Not sufficient. Really, you have to go much deeper. You have to take every application, every critical resource, even the network infrastructure itself, and decide what its risk factor is. What's its value, and what's the impact, or what's the risk factor, what's the impact if it's compromised. And you can start to build a matrix of every application and every infrastructure device in your environment and decide how much resources you need to spend to secure that thing. So if you have low risk areas, then you don't need to spend as much. And in this way, you can start to approach zero trust and hit the high impact, high risk things first and work your way down the matrix. And that way you can spread your budget and resources more intelligently over solving the problem. So, I mean, you guys must have some thoughts.
Yeah, I think the one thing to talk about your zone thing, right? I watch soccer a lot. I'm sure there are other sports that have the same thing. You have a concept of zonal marking, and then you have a concept of man-to-man marking. And literally, that's what I talk about when I talk to customers. Basically, what you're doing right now, zonal marking, is only as good as we are right now, and it's not really taking us forward in securing ourselves. What you really need is man-to-man marking, which is every user, every device, every point of data is important for you to know about and categorize, and then see how that plays out into your overall posture, basically, right? So
I think Neil said really well, like, zoning specific people or applications. But I also feel like, how do you step up from that? Leveraging MFA, can we also leverage another layer of, like, let's say a bastion host, which is, again, another layer where the user has to step in, authenticate via an MFA, and then actually log into a production server. Device management, device management tools, there are a lot, and I think there are a really great thing, the way you can actually manage devices and how users are logging in. Privileged access is an important factor. Is the user logging in the same password, which is valid for 10 years, or is it, being rotated every time, the user logs out? Are we capturing remote sessions, which are being used by users, to do some production changes? Are those being captured? Are these database changes being captured? And just some basic things, using bad passwords is just bad, and you need to have that sense of making sure our administrators, our chief engineers are not really using those concepts. And more we can leverage, identity management is a great thing. You can have zones, but how do you have zones of people? You have to start focusing on role-based access controlling. The larger challenge is not how you manage privilege control. The bigger challenge, I feel, is how do you provide privilege to people? And how do you identify whether this person is privileged enough to access this particular function? That is the challenge which companies have, and they end up leveraging or providing access to all of their users, which is not the right sort of privilege management. I end up all the administrators' users, right? I think that's the bigger challenge, which companies need to really tackle.
So that's a great point. Identity and access management is its own specialty. The days of saying, oh, we have a TACACS server to control access, those days are gone. If that's all you have, and you're putting users in there, and when they leave the company, you just take their credentials out, you're missing the mark. It's identity access management and time limits on passwords, right? Which is the utmost of annoyance to humans. But if you think about it, right? I mean, who likes to change our password every 30 days or 60 days? But if you go back, right? Nobody, I don't. But if you go back to the idea and the acceptance of the understanding that there are people in your network running around your network already. They've compromised accounts. They've been successful at phishing people. If the password they compromise expires in another 15 or 10 or whatever days, then you already know whoever gets in today has at most 30 days to find something bad to do before they simply can't get access anymore, using the credentials they've already stolen. So it's combinations, it's layers, it's all these layers of things, and they all sound, and each discrete idea is simple until you layer all these ideas together and things you need to do, designing zones, designing identity access management, password control. You start to go, wow, it's really complicated, and it's a whole area of specialty now. And it should be. And there's large groups of people and large organizations that are responsible for this because they have to be. Because whatever they cost It's less expensive than seeing your name on a presentation like this and getting famous for releasing, 3.6 million of your user accounts to the public.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
And I'd just like to add, there are things you can focus from an identity and access management perspective. But teams and security teams basically need to focus on stuff where it's hard to understand. There are, with all these cloud-based service provider models, you can literally just take a credit card, sign up for a new service, right? And then you end up, or a company ends up having and storing data in the cloud. How do security teams kind of get to know about that? That's a challenge. You can only control, or you can only identity access management when you know about that particular resource, right? And I think vendor management and the growing space of additional vendors, that's kind of just challenging all the different security teams, kind of how all the data is spread out. So data mapping is really hard, and that all falls back to identity and access management, because then there isn't a single identity. There are multiple identities which are spread all over the place.
Right. Yeah, and it's really a balance, right,
Yep.
between ensuring that you have those layers of security, but not creating a nuisance, right, or a hindrance to workflow and productivity, and being nimble at whether it's your network or your apps. You have to ensure that you balance both, which it's difficult, especially with the proliferation of different SaaS applications, and how you access those tools within the enterprise varies greatly between the SaaS providers. There's a lot of different options for how to set up the architecture and the design. So it's critically important, I think, to the whole model. So what do you guys think about? Are there really any alternatives out there to Zero Trust as far as approaching the new generation of network security?
So I think there's a lot of alternatives to the technology itself. I think Zero Trust is getting more and more mainstream now, and it's taken a long time. But fundamentally, it makes sense, because I think we've made it simple enough to understand, and I think so. There's that understanding of that it makes sense. For us, it's really NTT. As a service provider, we don't build any products, right? We actually work with everybody, and anybody who has something to talk about in the security space, we'll bring them to our labs and we'll go over that. So I think there's a lot of technology evolution that's going to happen. I think most of the companies that are in this space building products are trying to build that one product that takes care of everything. And I don't know whether that's the right way to do it. From a fundamental model perspective, I think we are where we are. I mean, you can never say what's going to come down the pike, but this is something that we do see that there is acceptance that this makes sense. When we talk about zonal marking not being good enough. So I don't know what you guys think.
I think if you're not going to trust no one, then why should you trust some? So I think the concept of Zero Trust, if you think about, if I don't know you and know why you're here and what you need and what you're entitled to, you are simply not allowed in my space. I think that concept's going to be with us a long time, and I agree with you. The tools and the approaches will change, and they'll get better over time, and hopefully simpler. And I think that as more apps move to the cloud, and in fact you have whole ecosystem from an enterprise in the cloud, I think it'll be actually easier to secure that, because at least you know where everything is. How big is your enterprise today? How many data centers do you have? And how many applications are actually distributed across those data centers? Applications don't tend to live, even monolithic or old, non-cloud applications don't live in one data center. You might have a piece here and it pulls in data from here and data from here, and it becomes so hard to even figure out where the application's pulling its data from. And application developers don't usually come to the discussion with networking and security and say, oh, by the way, my application's got 17 pieces in 14 data centers, right? They just say, here's where you get to the internet, or here's where the internet gets to my application. And that kind of thinking is in and of itself flawed.
Yeah, I still hear that same sentence, right? Yeah. I mean, and we forget the fact that, hey, we are collaborating with everybody. I mean,
internet is everywhere, including my data center is part of the internet. So yeah, I completely agree with you on that.
I personally feel, we had 10 years, a few years back, we had, perimeter-based security, and then we transitioned over to zero trust. It's not a term but the trend of how the adversaries are kind of changing, how attack vectors are changing. I just feel it's going to be like negative trust. It's because there is going to be enough trust on the users, enough trust on the device, but the attackers are going to go down much below those layers as well. Mm-hmm. They are going to look at operating systems. They are going to look at hypervisors. They are going to look at, hardwares like RAM, like how can they craft attacks against those. Mm-hmm. That's how I feel, because, you change if you see the attack models and how the new attackers are really attacking, the different ways they're trying to get in, the main motive is let's talk phishing, but, the new attacks towards hypervisors, hardwares. Mm-hmm. I think in the next 10, 15 years, that's how the model is probably going to change.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned it. I think I still remember a joke that, the best security is where you unplug your power. So, you're stuck. You can't do anything anymore. But I guess that's the best security that you can have. Yeah.
And that's a good final thought. Anything else from the panel? We're just out of time.
Trust no one.
Yep.
All right. Any questions for the panel?
So one of the technologies I didn't hear you talk about is role-based access. Are you seeing trends with at any major level for that type of technology to be used to support this strategy?
I know it was touched on role-based access and identity access control and privilege levels.
Yep.
That's probably, especially as far as infrastructure itself, one of the most important things you can do is establish who has, we all understand you shouldn't give the average user who just needs to say, pull interface statistics from a switch or router admin access, right? They should only have read access so they can pull that data out. But why even let them in the device in the first place to collect data? You should be extracting that data to a collection server or some kind of tool. There's tools that do this, where they access that tool, not the device itself. But also, who gets what role? And that's one of the hardest things to figure out if you have 6 levels of roles in your organization, who gets access to which role, and what are the requirements to move up and down, and what are the levels of approvals that need to happen?
Now, who decides that?
Yeah, right.
Right, and what's the justification for it? I guess I think the big thing is, as I was saying, if you club it along with the overall digital transformation strategy, then you are actually starting to look at your applications and how your data flows and all that. And that's what the security team needs to be doing as well, to categorizing the types of data. And so that if somebody needs very basic level, low security, or there's nothing like low security, but let's say lower risk kind of data, then that's all they get, and not, So I think the process behind coming into that conclusion is the challenging part, and then the tools are there, to be implementing those. So, yeah.
Actually, let me ask the audience a question. In any of your environments, do you know of a situation where, say, parts of the network that house accounting servers or HR servers are accessible, not the servers themselves, the people who are not saying HR may not have logins, but can anybody in your environment at least access that part of the network? Could they ping a device in that part of the network? I'm not saying I want anyone to give me an answer because you'd be admitting something. But think about that kind of thought process, right? Is there a reason for anybody who's not in HR to have access to the part of your network where HR applications live? And you start thinking in those terms, right? And you get to the point of how do we, keep those people out. If you're not in that department and you don't have a need for that data, you can't even come in that part of the house.
I'd just like to add, so there are 3 really fundamental things which every organization needs to think about: least privilege, security from insecurity, and trust but verify. You can leverage role-based access controls. Start with the least amount of privilege that's required, and then just start asking good questions, with every person who needs more privilege. I think that's how we're going to solve the problem. It's not going to be, hey, if you are this particular role, hey, you get this particular privilege. But if you're talking about access privilege management, it has to layer up a bit. You need, as security teams, as good security teams, you need to ask tough questions. Why exactly do you need that privilege? What exactly is the thing which you're trying to achieve with that specific privilege?
I was just curious as a follow-up question to ask your opinion on persona identification as it relates to role-based access. Understanding that once you sort of deploy a persona identification environment that, you might need to be a little bit more fluid in the beginning as roles might change and people change jobs. But, I've just heard and seen a lot more trends towards that, even though it might be hard to manage from an IT perspective. So any thoughts on that?
So if I'm not mistaken, your question is around how the fluidity of roles plays into an organization. And I think if that's a question, then we do have, most organizations do have a policy of changing passwords. I sure hope those guys in the videos, they did change their password after that video. But you have a 90-day, I think usually it's a 60-day, 90-day something, right? But most companies don't have a policy of checking who has what access to what application, which they should do every 6 months. You're absolutely right. There are people we are in with digital transformation and all the disruption that's happening. People are changing roles. They're taking on new roles, and what's happening with their old access, and do they still need it? So that's something that we recommend every 6 months needs to be done.
I think there has to be a balance. And as we grant privileges or access, right, we need to start saying, is the user really using that particular privilege? Can we, if he's not leveraging that particular piece of software or he's not logging into that particular network, can we basically disable that particular username and password or particular access? If he needs it later down the line, 6 months later, he can always request it back. That is how you can really protect, and kind of control privilege and role-based access control. That's what I think, because as more and more roles, as more and more duties start getting added to a specific user, it's going to pile up a lot of access. And then it's going to be like a specific user will have access to like 100 pieces of software, 100 different services. And then it's hard to control data at that particular time, from a breach perspective if that happens.
Actually, I've seen approaches to this in one company where they would send a survey out to managers of all teams about twice a year, and it was really just a verification of who on your team needs access to specific systems. Now, keep in mind, I've come from the network side, so the people I've been working with and teams I've been on have had access to infrastructure. And probably were the highest risk group if something went awry or access got out of control. But they would ask your manager, does this group of people still need access? And you start realizing, oh, well, this guy left, or this guy moved to a different department, or this guy, doesn't work here, or this guy was escorted out by security. And then you start asking questions, well, it happens. The kind with the guns, not like network security. But then you start asking questions, well, why aren't the identity and access management systems tied into HR to know, and some are, don't get me wrong, there are solutions in the market like SAP and PeopleSoft have solutions and modules for that. So if you change roles and you're no longer, say, in network architecture, you've now moved to, procurement, well, let's take away all your access. You don't still need access to all that infrastructure. But again, it's more integration, more time, more governance, because someone has to make the rule. Are you going to arbitrarily go, hey, I think we ought to deploy something with our HR management system? You need to, I think, have a policy around that.
Yeah, the biggest challenge in this kind of a thing is you want to do it every 6 months, but then you try to figure out what's the value you get out of it. The value is you're not on the front page of the newspaper in the wrong way, right? So the funny thing about this is that we don't usually give that much importance to things that don't happen, right? and so you avoided something. There's not much credit for that.
Until they do.
Yes, exactly. So.
Happens, yeah.
So you've been talking about access for people. What about access for bots, automation? How does that play into a zero trust model?
That's actually, oh, you want to go ahead?
Go ahead.
So that's a really good question, especially in terms of when we actively promote things like robotic process automation for mundane tasks like changing VLANs on switches based on tickets being put into a ticketing system. They require the same roles and permissions as people because those tools are subject to misuse and maybe even more so, or compromise, and maybe even more so because those tools are written by software developers who may not be thinking on the broader scale of what could possibly go wrong. They're like, oh, we're tied in a TAC Act. You can't even launch this script if you don't have access to it. Well, there's so much more to securing that set of scripts than just who can launch it and from where. So everything. Why treat a piece of code that triggers a service or change any different than you treat a person?
And I'd like to add that, if you're focusing on automation, with automated deployments, moving towards or fast moving towards productions, you have to automate, right? And at that point of time, it's really the least amount of privileges you can, make that bot really work. How you can have an audit trail around what that particular bot is really doing, in terms of creating tickets, making sure when they're being launched to productions, having an audit trail to that. Attaching, pull requests and all those, different various aspects of, whatever functionality it's really focusing on. And having the capability to tie in monitors and alerts when things go bad is how you can really limit the amount of bad that a specific bot can do with the amount of leverage it has.
Yeah, I think we're talking about users and devices in the same concept, right? I mean, we're calling it users, but it's really users and devices.
Like your switch doesn't know whether that VLAN on that port was changed by a human or a script.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you, panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.